I wasn't supposed to be home that Tuesday morning in early October because a mediation at my consulting firm in downtown Denver had been on my calendar for weeks, the kind of high-stakes corporate dispute that usually dragged on for hours, but at the last minute one of the parties backed out, and my assistant called to tell me it was canceled. So instead of sitting in a sterile conference room pretending to be neutral while executives argued over numbers, I found myself driving back toward our house in Aurora just before 10, thinking I would grab a clean jacket I had forgotten and maybe surprise my wife, Megan Carter, with breakfast from the little cafe she liked near Alameda Avenue. The drive felt almost indulgent, like I had stolen time from my own schedule, and I remember feeling oddly light as I turned into our neighborhood because it had been a while since I was home during daylight hours on a weekday, my life lately revolving around early departures and late returns, client dinners, and endless conference calls, the kind of rhythm that makes days blur together until weekends feel theoretical rather than real. I parked in the driveway and noticed Megan's SUV was still there, which wasn't unusual since she worked remotely most days, and I smiled to myself thinking how surprised she would be to see me walking with coffee and pastries, maybe even steal an hour together before I had to head back to the office. The moment I unlocked the front door, though, something felt off, not dramatically wrong, but subtly strange, like walking into a room where the air is shifted, because the house was unnaturally quiet in that deliberate way that only happens when people believe they are alone, and I stood there for a second listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the hallway clock, expecting to hear her on a work call, or moving around upstairs. Instead, I caught the faint echo of voices drifting in from the back patio, light and animated, layered with the unmistakable sound of laughter that was not meant to carry inside. I set my briefcase down quietly on the entryway table, without fully knowing why I was being careful, and I moved down the hallway toward the kitchen, each step slow and measured, the polished hardwood cool under my shoes, until I reached the sliding glass doors that led to the patio. Through the thin gap, where the door wasn't completely sealed, I could hear Megan's voice clearly now, brighter and freer than it sounded around me in months, and there were at least 2 other women with her, their tones familiar enough that I recognized them as her friends from her Pilates class, the ones who came over for wine nights and talked about travel plans and interior renovations. I was about to slide the door open and step outside with a smile, ready to announce my unexpected return, when her laughter sharpened into words that stopped me mid-motion, and I froze with my hand hovering inches from the handle, as she said she was free to do whatever she wanted and that I was too distracted to ever notice. The sentence landed with a clarity that cut through me, not because I immediately understood every implication, but because of the confidence in her voice, the ease with which she said it, as if it were a well-established truth among them. One of her friends responded with a low whistle, and another said something about risk and excitement, their voices overlapping in conspiratorial amusement. And Megan laughed again, that same unguarded laugh I had once thought was reserved for me in that suspended moment. I became acutely aware of everything at once, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the kitchen from earlier, the sunlight spilling across the countertops, the steady beat of my own pulse in my ears, and I realized how rarely I had been present in this house during mornings like this, how often I convinced myself that providing, scheduling, strategizing, and negotiating were equivalent to being attentive. I did not step outside, and I did not clear my throat or make my presence known. I simply stood there absorbing the tone and rhythm of her voice as she continued speaking about independence and freedom, about how easy it was to maintain appearances when someone was always consumed by work. The patio door reflected a faint image of me in my suit, ties slightly loosened from the drive, jacket folded over my arm, looking like a stranger in my own home, and I felt a slow tightening in my chest that was not anger exactly, but something heavier, a realization forming, without yet having shape, as the laughter outside carried on and the October sun cast long, in different shadows across the kitchen floor. She told him our marriage wasn't bad, it was nothing, and the way she said it was what hollowed me out because there was no bitterness in her tone, no anger, no trace of resentment that I could cling to as evidence of some fight we had never resolved. Just a calm assessment, as if she were reviewing an apartment listing rather than describing the life we had built together, and she compared to living with a roommate who paid the mortgage and stayed out of her way, her voice light and almost amused, as if she had distilled our entire relationship into a convenient arrangement that required no emotional investment on her part. I felt the words settle into me with a slow, suffocating weight, because I had always believed that stability was a virtue, that predictability meant security, that the fact we did not scream at each other or slam doors was proof we were doing something right. Yet hearing her reduce our marriage to an efficient cohabitation agreement made me realize that what I saw as peace she experienced is absence. One of her friends asked if she felt guilty, and I could hear the faint clink of a glass being set down on the patio table, the pause hanging for half a second before Megan laughed again, a short, dismissive laugh that carried none of the hesitation I would have expected if she were wrestling with anything remotely resembling conscience. And she said she could disappear for a weekend, and I would never question it because I was always too busy chasing clients, too wrapped up in deadlines and projections to notice the gaps in her schedule. The others laughed with her, not cruelly but conspiratorially. The kind of laughter that signals shared understanding, and I stood frozen just inside the kitchen doorway, realizing that in her mind my trust was not a compliment but a weakness, not a sign of faith in her, but proof that I was inattentive enough to be deceived without effort. She went on to say that I love the idea of being a husband more than the reality of being present, that as long as the bills were paid and the house was maintained, I consider my role fulfilled. And while I wanted to recoil at the exaggeration, I could not ignore the uncomfortable flicker of recognition that passed through me, because there had been countless evenings when I came home mentally drained and chose the silence of my laptop over conversation, telling myself that we would have time later to reconnect, that once this quarter ended or once that contract was secured, I would finally slow down. Listening to her describe me as predictable and harmless, as someone who would never make waves or demand explanations, I understood that she was not venting frustration in the way married people sometimes do when they feel unseen. She was delivering a verdict on a relationship she had already abandoned in her own mind. There was pride in her voice when she said she had figured out how to structure her life around my blind spots, how easy it was to cultivate her own world parallel to mine without intersecting too closely, and the realization struck me with clarity that left no room for denial. She had not merely drifted emotionally. She had consciously stepped away and reframed it as empowerment. In that moment, the house no longer felt like a shared space, but like a stage set where I had been performing the role of devoted provider while she rehearsed a different narrative entirely. And I felt something inside me shift, not explosively, but with quiet finality, as I understood that the distance between us had not appeared overnight and had not been accidental. It had been chosen, curated, and even celebrated in my absence. Instead of confronting her, I left quietly that morning, stepping back from the sliding door as carefully as I had approached it, picking up my briefcase and walking out the front door without making a sound, because something in me understood that whatever I had just heard could not be undone by an impulsive argument on the patio in front of her friends, and I needed clarity more than I needed a scene. I drove back toward Denver in a haze, barely registering traffic lights or the skyline coming into view, replaying her words over and over until they lost their sharp edges and became something colder and more analytical inside my head. And by the time I reached the office, I'd already decided that I would not react emotionally, I would observe. Over the next week, I watched patterns instead of making accusations, and it was remarkable how obvious things became once I stopped assuming innocence as the default setting of our marriage, because she began coming home later every night with explanations that were polished, but then stories about spontaneous work mixers in Cherry Creek that ran long, because everyone was networking about reconnecting with old college friends in Boulder who were in town unexpectedly and insisted on catching up over drinks, about needing space to decompress after busy days that I had apparently failed to notice were exhausting her. I listened without interrupting, nodded at the appropriate moments, and pretended to scroll through emails while she spoke, and the more neutral I remained, the more freely she elaborated, filling in details that sounded rehearsed rather than remembered. I started paying attention to small things I had overlooked for months, the way she changed outfits twice before leaving the evenings, the subtle shift in her makeup routine that was too deliberate to be casual, the faint scent of a different cologne clinging to her hair once when she leaned over to grab her purse, and I cataloged each observation not with rage, but with a detached precision that surprised even me. I checked timestamps on her texts when her phone lit up on the kitchen counter, noticed how she angled the screen away when responding, and observed how quickly she deleted notifications as if clearing a trail. It was not paranoia anymore. It was pattern recognition, and I felt myself stepping into a role I was professionally comfortable with, gathering information before drawing conclusions. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, her cousin Olivia texted me unexpectedly, and Olivia was not the dramatic type, not someone who thrived on stirring conflict. So when her name appeared on my screen followed by the words, "I think you need to see this," I felt a quiet tightening in my chest that told me this was not trivial. She sent screenshots of a second Instagram account under a slightly altered version of Megan's name, an account I had never seen, and that was clearly curated for a different audience. And as I scrolled through the images, my vision felt strangely focused, almost clinical, as if I were reviewing evidence rather than my own wife's life. There were rooftop bar photos taken against the Denver skyline at night, string lights glowing overhead, glasses raised in celebratory poses, and captions about being unattached, about rediscovering herself, about leaning into her freedom, and refusing to apologize for wanting more, phrases that felt like direct echoes of what I'd overheard on the patio. In one picture, she was wearing a black dress I had never seen before, her hair loose and perfectly styled, and she was holding onto some guy's arm with an ease that suggested familiarity rather than chance proximity, her hand resting just above his elbow as she leaned slightly into him, smiling in a way that was intimate without being overtly explicit. The comments under the photo were filled with inside jokes and heart emojis from people I did not recognize, and nowhere in that curated grid of images was there any indication that she was married, that she shared a home in Aurora, that someone was paying a mortgage she once joked about as if it were a background utility. I sat at my desk staring at those screenshots for a long time, not because I doubted what they meant, but because the confirmation shifted something fundamental inside me, transforming suspicion into certainty. And I realized that the version of our marriage she described to her friends was not an exaggeration for dramatic effect, but a narrative she had fully embraced and was actively broadcasting to an audience that did not include me. The messages Olivia forwarded were not dramatic declarations written in anger or desperation. They were casual, almost breezy exchanges where Megan explained herself to strangers and acquaintances with the kind of confidence that only comes from repetition, and as I read through them, I could see how carefully she had constructed her version of reality. She told people she was technically married, but basically single, adding a laughing emoji in one thread as if the distinction were harmless and clever rather than corrosive, and she described our life together as a logistical arrangement, saying we just shared a house and nothing else, that we operated on separate schedules, separate priorities, separate emotional planes. In another message, she wrote that she came and went as she pleased because I was too wrapped up in my own ambitions to ever notice or care, that as long as the mortgage cleared and the lights stayed on, I considered my job done. And reading those lines in her own typed words stripped away any lingering doubt I might have clung to about misunderstanding tone or context. What unsettled me most was not the insinuation of other men or late nights, or even the rooftop photos. It was the way she minimized our entire marriage into a footnote in her story, reducing me to a technicality she mentioned only to add intrigue, as if being basically single, while married made her more interesting, more desirable, more untethered. She framed our home in Aurora as a convenient base rather than shared life, a comfortable staging ground for the version of herself she preferred to present publicly. And the more I read, the more I realized that this was not reckless venting. It was a coherent narrative she had rehearsed and refined. She explained to one person that I preferred stability and routine, and that she preferred spontaneity and excitement. But instead of admitting that those differences required conversation or resolution, she positioned herself as someone who had quietly outgrown a static environment, as if I were a piece of outdated furniture she had decided not to discard yet, because it was still functional. There were timestamps on these messages that overlapped with evenings when she had told me she was working late or meeting colleagues, and the dissonance between the domestic scenes I remembered and the words glowing on my phone created a strange attachment inside me, a sensation that felt less like heartbreak and more like recalibration. I expected anger to surge, for jealousy or humiliation take over, but what replaced the initial shock was something steadier and far more deliberate. The shock had been sharp and disorienting, a sudden drop in altitude, but now as I scrolled through screenshot after screenshot, I felt my breathing even out, my thoughts align, my attention narrow. She had created a framework where I was not a partner but background noise, an atmospheric presence that funded her freedom without interfering in it. And seeing that description written so casually allowed me to step outside the emotional fog and evaluate the structure she had built. In her story, I was a predictable provider who would never disrupt the illusion because I was too occupied with my own pursuits, too rational, too composed, and the irony of that assumption was not lost on me as I sat there dissecting every line she had typed. She believed I would remain unaware because she had defined me as someone incapable of noticing nuance, someone satisfied with surface harmony, and the more I absorbed that belief, the clearer my own path became. The humiliation I might have felt began to dissolve into focus because narratives can be rewritten, structures can be dismantled, and illusions rely on the cooperation of those who are meant to remain blind. She had underestimated not my availability but my attention, and in doing so she had handed me a detailed map of how she viewed our marriage, how she justified her actions, and how confidently she assumed I would never step out of the background she assigned me. A few days later, I ran into an acquaintance named Trevor at a Home Depot in Centennial, and it was such an ordinary, mundane setting that the conversation caught me completely off guard. Because I was standing in the lighting aisle comparing two nearly identical fixtures for the hallway renovation Megan had insisted we start months ago, trying to decide which finish would look better against the neutral walls. When I heard my name called in that casual, friendly tone reserved for people you recognize but do not know well enough to confide in, Trevor walked over with a cart full of lumber and contractor-grade paint, wearing jeans dusted with drywall powder, and after a few minutes of generic small talk about work and the housing market, he tilted his head slightly and asked, with what he clearly believed was harmless curiosity, whether Megan and I were in an open marriage. The question was delivered without malice, almost conversationally, as if he were asking whether we had remodeled our kitchen or adopted a dog, and for a split second I wondered if I had misheard him. But he continued speaking, saying that at a recent dinner party her best friend Ashley had mentioned that Megan was basically single in everything but paperwork, that we were more roommates than spouses, and that I was the stable one who did not mind if she explored as long as the bills were covered. He said it lightly, even with a faint smile, as though he assumed I was in on the arrangement, and that assumption was what settled into me like a final piece of evidence sliding into place. I did not react outwardly, did not correct him or demand clarification, because the realization unfolding inside me required stillness rather than confrontation. And as he continued describing how Ashley had laughed and described Megan as someone rediscovering herself, I felt the last remnants of denial dissolve. This was not confined to private messages or hidden social media accounts. It was a public rebranding of our marriage, an intentional reshaping of our story that extended beyond rooftop bars and curated captions into living rooms and dinner tables, where people we knew were being briefed on a version of our life that positioned me as a passive accessory. Trevor mentioned that Ashley had encouraged Megan to take spontaneous trips, to say yes to last-minute getaways without over-explaining, and to lean into the idea that my silence meant consent, that my focus on work created a natural buffer she could hide behind. Hearing it framed that way crystallized everything I had observed over the previous week: the late nights in Cherry Creek, the vague stories about reconnecting in Boulder, the confident captions about freedom, all of it part of a coordinated narrative reinforced by someone who appeared to be actively advising her. Ashley was not merely a friend offering sympathy. She was an architect reinforcing the storyline that Megan was essentially unattached, that our marriage was a technicality, that I was predictable enough to provide cover without ever challenging the illusion. As Trevor finished describing the dinner party gossip, he seemed almost amused by the modernity of it all, commenting that times were changing and that unconventional arrangements were becoming more common, and I realized that in the circles Megan was frequenting our relationship had already been recategorized without my knowledge. I stood there under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hardware store holding a brushed nickel fixture and felt something steady and immovable settle inside me, because this was no longer about flirtation or momentary discontent. It was about reputation and narrative control. She had not only detached emotionally, she had begun redefining our marriage publicly in a way that relied on my presumed ignorance, an understanding that shifted my perspective from wounded husband to careful observer of strategy that had been unfolding in plain sight. I checked Megan's phone one night after she fell asleep, and I did it without drama or shaking hands, waiting until her breathing settled into the slow, even rhythm that told me she was fully under, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting a muted light across the room as I carefully slid the device from the nightstand where she had left it charging. The passcode had not changed, which almost felt insulting in its implication that she did not believe I would ever look. And as I scrolled through her messages, I found exactly what I expected, and yet felt the weight of it anyway. There were long threads with Ashley, not casual exchanges, but strategic conversations. And in one message, Ashley told her she deserved excitement, that life was too short to feel bored in a marriage that functioned like a business arrangement, and that if she pushed boundaries, I would adapt because men like me value stability over conflict. Ashley wrote that I would grumble internally, but ultimately accept whatever narrative Megan presented, that I was too pragmatic to blow up my own life. And Megan responded with laughing emojis and comments about how predictable I was, how easy it had become to operate around my routines. Reading those words removed any lingering ambiguity because it was no longer about impulse or confusion. It was deliberate testing of limits backed by the confidence that I would not resist. And instead of waking her or confronting her in that dimly lit bedroom, I placed the phone back exactly where it had been and lay there staring at the ceiling until dawn, my mind moving to logistics rather than arguments. The next morning I left for work as usual, kissed her on the cheek in a gesture that now felt like muscle memory rather than intimacy, and once I was at my office, I closed my door and began making calls that had nothing to do with mediation or corporate disputes. I contacted an attorney in Colorado Springs whose name I had once saved from a referral years earlier when we drafted our prenuptial agreement in 2017, and I scheduled a consultation under the pretense of reviewing estate planning updates, keeping my tone measured and professional as I requested copies of the signed documents and clarification on specific clauses regarding asset separation and infidelity provisions. That afternoon I reviewed the prenup in detail, every paragraph and amendment, reacquainted myself with the structure we had agreed upon when optimism had framed it as a precaution rather than a forecast. I then moved a significant portion of my personal funds into a newly established account solely in my name, ensuring that any future transactions would be clearly delineated, documenting transfers meticulously, so that nothing could later be misconstrued. I also secured a lake cabin in Grand Lake, a property that had remained solely in my name from the beginning, because I had purchased it before we were married, and I contacted the property manager to confirm updated access codes and change the digital locks without discussion, citing routine security upgrades. Each step was executed quietly, without deviation from my usual schedule, without raised voices or visible tension at home, because preparation required discretion and composure rather than theatrics. I continued attending dinners, responding to her small talk, maintaining the rhythm she believed she understood, all while constructing an exit plan that was practical, documented, and insulated against the narrative she had been spreading. There was a strange calm and methodical nature of it all, a clarity that replaced the earlier sting of betrayal. Because once I accepted that she had already reframed our marriage publicly, I no longer felt obligated to protect an illusion she was actively dismantling. Instead of arguing or pleading for acknowledgement, I shifted my focus to ensuring that when the time came, my departure would not be reactive but precise, supported by documentation, financial boundaries, and legal counsel. I did not tip her off, did not alter my demeanor, and did not deviate from routine, because the most effective response to someone who assumes will adapt is to quietly prepare in a way they never anticipated. 2 weeks later, I came home early on a Thursday while she was out, and I chose that day deliberately because she had mentioned a networking happy hour that would stretch well past dinner, which meant I would have the house to myself long enough to move with precision rather than haste. And as I unlocked the front door, the familiarity of the space felt different. Not heavy or sentimental, but neutral, like walking through a property I had already mentally vacated. I did not wander from room to room or pause to reconsider. I went straight upstairs to the closet and pulled 3 large duffel bags from the top shelf, setting them neatly on the bed before I began packing only what was mine in the most literal sense, essentials that could not be replaced or disputed. I folded a week's worth of clothes with deliberate care, selecting practical pieces rather than anything symbolic. Packed my laptop, external hard drives, and a small fireproof folder containing my passport, birth certificate, social security card, the deed to the lake cabin in Grand Lake, and copies of our 2017 prenuptial agreement that I had already reviewed with my attorney. I opened the safe in my office and removed personal financial records, tax documents, and a handful of letters from my father that I had kept tucked away for years, sliding them into the second bag along with the watch he had given me when I started my firm, a few framed photographs from before the marriage, and a leather-bound journal I used during the early years of building my career. I left behind every designer bag she loved to showcase online, each carefully staged accessory that appeared in curated photos of our living room, and I did not touch the furniture she had insisted we purchase because it photographed well the velvet sectional, the sculptural coffee table, the statement lighting fixtures I had once debated under fluorescent lights at Home Depot, all of it remaining exactly as she preferred to display it. I did not remove the artwork from the walls or the decorative pieces she rotated seasonally for her social media aesthetic, because none of those items were essential to who I was outside of the image she had been constructing. Once the bags were packed, I carried them downstairs one at a time, placing them discreetly in the trunk of my car parked in the garage, and then I returned to the kitchen where the island stood pristine beneath recessed lighting, the same surface where we had once hosted dinners and holiday gatherings. I placed a single envelope in the center, aligned carefully with the edge as if it were part of the decor, and inside were the signed divorce papers my attorney had prepared, filed in accordance with Colorado law, along with clear instructions for splitting the remaining shared bills and timelines for transferring utilities solely into her name. There was no handwritten note, no explanation, no accusation, and no emotional appeal, only documentation clarity, because everything that needed to be said had already been expressed in the narrative she chose to circulate. I stood there for a moment, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement of finality, recognizing that this was the quietest and most direct response I could offer to someone who had publicly declared herself unattached while benefiting from the structure of marriage. If she wanted to live as though she were single, to describe me as background noise funding her freedom, then I was going to remove the ambiguity entirely and make it official. I turned off the lights, closed the door behind me without slamming it, and drove away with 3 duffel bags and a future that no longer required adaptation to someone else's version of the truth. When she got home that night and realized the joint account was closed and I was gone, I was already halfway up the highway toward Grand Lake, watching the city lights thin out of my rearview mirror. And by the time my phone began vibrating against the passenger seat, I knew exactly what happened inside that kitchen. The first wave of messages came in rapid succession, sharp and accusatory, demanding to know what kind of stunt I thought I was pulling and how I could blindside her like this without even having conversation. And there was a bitter irony in reading those words because she had been the one reframing our marriage in private chats and public dinners without one sitting down across from me to acknowledge it openly. She accused me of overreacting, of taking harmless venting and blowing it out of proportion, of turning what she described as a phase of self-discovery into a legal ambush. And the tone carried more outrage than grief, more frustration at losing control of the narrative than sadness at losing me. Then, as the hours passed and I did not respond, the messages shifted in texture, softening at the edges, her words becoming less combative and more incredulous, saying she never expected me to actually leave, that she thought I understood her need for space, that she assumed I would adapt like I always did. That sentence lingered on my screen longer than the others because it confirmed everything I had already accepted. She had built her behavior on the certainty that I would absorb it without consequence, that I would remain steady in the background no matter how far she stretched the boundaries. There were missed calls layered between texts, voicemails that began with clipped anger and ended with strained attempts at reassurance. But I let them accumulate unanswered while the mountains rose around me and the air grew thinner and colder. At the cabin the next morning, I woke before sunrise to a silence that felt different from the quiet in our house in Aurora. This was not the careful quiet of secrecy, but the natural stillness of water and pine trees, and I stepped outside onto the aging wooden deck with a thermos of coffee and began examining the warped boards that had needed attention for years. I spent hours removing nails, replacing splintered planks, sanding down rough edges until my hands were coated in sawdust, the physical labor grounding in a way that corporate negotiations and curated dinner conversations never had been. Each time my phone vibrated inside on the kitchen counter, I let it ring through, not out of spite but out of clarity, because responding would have pulled me back into the reactive dynamic she expected. She did not miss me in the way her softened messages implied. She missed the stability I provided, the predictable infrastructure of finances and routine that allowed her to experiment with detachment without consequence, and understanding that stripped away any lingering guilt. As I tightened screws into fresh wood and leaned back to inspect the straight lines of the rebuilt railing, I felt a steadiness settle into my chest that I had not experienced in years, a quiet assurance that came from stepping out of roles she had reduced me to and choosing not to perform it anymore. The mountains did not demand adaptation or silence. They did not reinterpret my presence to suit their narrative, and for the first time in a long time my life felt aligned with my actions, uncomplicated by someone else's rebranding of who I was supposed to be.